The sun hadn't yet risen when Dr. Malcolm Vance, a reclusive retired veterinarian, awoke with a familiar pang of sorrow that had haunted him for the past 7 years. He had lived alone in the isolated cabin at the edge of Silver Rock, Arizona, since that day, the day the child had died in his care, despite every ounce of his skill and every prayer he had whispered. Since then, he had abandoned his calling, retreating from the world he once saved lives in. His heart had broken, and there was no patching it back together. The quiet that surrounded his cabin in the mountains was his solace. There was no one to remind him of the loss he carried. He'd built this life in silence, keeping to himself, only the wind and the distant calls of coyotes keeping him company. But that morning, the silence was broken. A soft, rhythmic tap, tap, tap came from the wooden porch, startling him awake. He hadn't expected visitors. No one ever came up here, not unless they needed something he couldn't give. Rubbing his eyes, Malcolm stood and made his way to the door, every step heavy with years of regret. Opening the door, his eyes narrowed at the unexpected sight before him. A wild mustang stood there, its coat a reddish brown, marked with the scars of harsh terrain. Its body was thin, ribs visible beneath the worn skin, but it was its eyes, wild, pleading, desperate, that made his heart skip a beat. The horse wasn't alone. Beside her, collapsed on the ground, lay a foal, its small body trembling with each shallow breath. The creature was gasping for air, its tiny body slick with sweat, feverish, and barely conscious. For a moment, Malcolm stood frozen, staring at the two animals. The mustang's eyes met his, and for the first time in years he felt something stir inside him. A feeling he hadn't allowed himself to feel since he walked away from his practice. Responsibility? He had sworn off the life he once led, but something in that gaze told him that this was no ordinary creature. This was a plea, not just from the foal, but from the mare herself. She knew him, somehow. "Hope," Malcolm murmured under his breath, reading the desperation in her eyes. He didn't know why, but he knew that name was right for her. The foal, barely able to move, gave a soft whinny, and Malcolm felt his heart break in an instant. Without thinking, he knelt beside the foal, his years of training as a veterinarian flooding back like a rush of cold water. Malcolm's hands were trembling as he gently ran them over the foal's body. Its temperature was dangerously high, and the faint sound of its breathing made it clear. It wasn't long for this world unless something drastic happened. The mare, Hope, nuzzled him gently, nudging him as though urging him to do something, anything. "Damn it," Malcolm cursed under his breath, standing up quickly. I can't. I'm not that man anymore." His voice cracked as he spoke the words he had convinced himself were true for so long. But Hope wasn't giving up. The mare stood tall, her unwavering gaze locked on him as though willing him to act. It was then that the memories of his past life surged through him, of animals he'd saved, of lives he had mended with his hands. His heart ached, but it wasn't just from the guilt anymore. There was still a spark inside him, a spark he had buried deep, but it had been reignited by this wild mare's silent plea. Malcolm gritted his teeth. His hands may have been stained with failure, but he couldn't walk away from this, not when something in him was telling him that this was the moment he had been waiting for. "All right," he whispered to the mare, his voice thick with emotion. "I'll do what I can." He hurried inside the cabin to gather the supplies he kept hidden away. It had been years since he'd used them, but his hands still knew the motions, even if his heart wasn't ready. He grabbed a needle, a syringe, and the old dusty bag of fluid he had stored for emergencies. The whole time, Hope stood outside, watching him with an intensity that made his chest tighten. Returning to the foal, Malcolm worked quickly, his mind locked into familiar patterns, despite the rust of years of disuse. His movements were efficient, calm, almost as if no time had passed. He attached the IV, careful with every needle prick, every adjustment, as if his hands remembered the weight of responsibility, even if his heart didn't want to. Hope stood by his side, never straying far. She was tired, and the journey had drained her, But she didn't move. She stayed there, guarding her foal, waiting for a miracle. Her presence felt like a silent promise. This foal wasn't going to die. Not if she could help it. "Come on, little one. You've still got a chance," Malcolm whispered, more to himself than the foal. His voice cracked, but he refused to let the tears come. He had learned long ago that shedding tears only led to more pain. But this was different. For the first time in years, he felt the stirring of hope inside him. Maybe, just maybe, he could redeem himself after all. And in that quiet, early morning hour, with hope standing steadfast by his side, Malcolm Vance made a choice. He would not let this foal die, not if he could help it. And perhaps in saving the life of this wild creature, he might just find a way to save himself. The sun had climbed higher by the time Malcolm finished his work. Sweat dripped from his brow, his hands trembling, not only from the exhaustion of the day, but from the flood of emotions he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. He stood, wiped his forehead with the back of his sleeve, and glanced over at Hope. The mare was still there, her gaze never leaving him, her expression both grateful and expectant. The foal was alive. Barely, but alive. As Malcolm slowly sank onto the porch steps, he realized that he hadn't breathed properly in what felt like a lifetime. Every exhale was a release of the burden that had weighed so heavily on his chest for the past 7 years. And yet, the relief was fleeting, replaced by the gnawing feeling of doubt that always came after he made a choice that felt so right, yet so wrong at the same time. The guilt surged again. His mind replayed the events that led him to leave his practice, the people he had failed, the patient who never made it. The child's face, innocent and trusting, haunted him, reminding him of his perceived failure. He had given everything to the field of veterinary care. Every hour spent working in the clinic, every moment spent trying to save animals from disease and injury. And yet, when it mattered most, when a life was on the line, he had failed. He had always been a man of logic, of reason. The science of his work had come naturally to him, but when it came to emotions, the stuff that made people human, he had always struggled. That was why the death of that child had shattered him. It wasn't just that he failed in the medical sense. It was that he failed on a deeper level. He wasn't able to save a life when he was supposed to, and that had broken him in a way that no amount of training could have prepared him for. Now, here he was again, in the thick of it. Only this time, it wasn't a child he was trying to save. It was a foal, a dying creature brought to his doorstep by a wild mare who seemed to understand that he was the only one who could help. "I'm not that man anymore," Malcolm muttered to himself, his voice thick with the weight of his own self-doubt. He couldn't help it. It was too soon, too raw. The fear of failure gripped him like a vice, squeezing the life out of any hope he'd allowed himself to feel. Hope stood quietly nearby, as if sensing his turmoil. She had already been through so much, through the treacherous mountain paths, through whatever danger had forced her to seek him out. She stood there, waiting, patient, her eyes following every movement he made. Her silence spoke volumes, but Malcolm couldn't quite interpret it. What did she expect of him? Did she think he could save her foal? Did she expect him to be the man he used to be? The man who could heal, who could fix broken things? He swallowed hard, looking away from Hope's steady gaze. It was too much to bear. This wild creature had just walked into his life, demanding something from him he wasn't sure he could give. For the next several hours, Malcolm stayed by the foal's side. He kept the fluids running, checked its temperature every so often, and did everything in his power to stabilize the creature. But it wasn't easy. The foal's condition fluctuated, and there were moments when it seemed as though it was slipping away. Yet, each time it took a turn for the worse. Hope would nudge the foal gently, as though encouraging it to hold on. Malcolm had seen this kind of battle before. He knew how fragile life could be, how quickly it could slip through one's fingers. He had witnessed it countless times during his career, and it never got easier. It wasn't the science that bothered him. It was the weight of the lives he had to carry. The responsibility of every creature in his care, that weight was crushing, and Malcolm had never been able to shake it. But this wasn't just another patient. This was a life being fought for in front of him. It wasn't some faceless animal. It was Hope's foal, a creature that had traveled across rugged terrain, defied all odds, and sought him out in a desperate bid to survive. And for the first time in years, Malcolm found himself at the mercy of something he couldn't control, his own emotions. Malcolm glanced up, catching the mare's watchful eye again. She stood at the edge of the porch, her body trembling from exhaustion. Yet still, she waited. The bond between them was undeniable, and it hit him hard. This wasn't about saving an animal. It was about redemption. It was about healing the part of him that had broken all those years ago. You're not just saving her, he whispered to himself, almost as though the words were meant to remind him. You're saving yourself. He stood and made his way to the small kitchen, his movements slow and deliberate. His hands shook as he reached for the kettle, filling it with water for some tea. The room felt small and suffocating, the weight of his own thoughts pressing down on him. As the kettle whistled, he poured the boiling water into a mug, his gaze lingering on the mare outside. Hope hadn't moved. She had become a symbol to him, of everything he'd lost, and everything he still had to gain. The wild mustang, with her fierce determination and unwavering loyalty, had come to him in his darkest hour, and in doing so, she had reawakened something within him that he thought was long gone. Malcolm sipped his tea slowly, staring out the window, his thoughts a jumbled mess. For 7 years, he had run from his past. He had lived in isolation, hiding from the ghosts that haunted him. But now, with Hope and her foal on his doorstep, he was forced to confront them once more. The question he had been avoiding, could he heal, could he make things right, was no longer a distant thought. It was right in front of him, standing on the edge of his porch. But as the night drew closer, Malcolm felt a sense of determination settle in. He wouldn't let the past define him. Not now. Not when he had a chance to make a difference again. He glanced back at the foal, who was still breathing, still fighting. For the first time in years, Malcolm allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, there was a second chance for him. A chance to do what he was born to do, to heal. The night passed slowly, each tick of the clock echoing in Malcolm's mind like the rhythm of a distant drum, one that grew louder the longer he stayed by the foal's side. It was as if time itself had bent around the tiny, fragile creature in front of him, the moments stretching on endlessly. Hope stood silently in the same spot, only moving to nuzzle the foal now and then. Her presence, though silent, was commanding. She had already shown him that she wasn't just a wild animal. She was a mother, a protector, and a fighter. And somehow, by simply existing, she was drawing him back to the man he once was. She was bringing him back from the edge. Malcolm watched the foal, now named Chance, with a mixture of concern and hope. The small body shivered in the cold night air, its breathing still shallow and labored. The fever hadn't broken, and every few minutes the foal would let out a weak whinny, as if pleading for something Malcolm couldn't quite give. The thought of failure, the thought of losing another life under his care, was almost too much to bear. He couldn't let it happen. Not this time. He wouldn't allow it. By morning, the sun broke over the horizon, casting a soft, golden light across the rugged mountainside. It was then that Malcolm stood up, his back aching from hours spent hunched over the foal. His mind was clear, though, and in that moment, a quiet determination settled over him. He had no other choice now. He couldn't walk away. "All right, Chance," Malcolm whispered, kneeling down beside the foal once again. "Let's see if we can give you a fighting chance." He worked quickly, grabbing a bag of fluids he had tucked away and hooking it up to the IV. His hands were steady now, despite the internal storm that raged within him. The foal's body was so fragile, too fragile it seemed. The smallest misstep could cost him everything. But the more he worked, the more something inside him shifted. It wasn't just about saving this foal anymore. It was about proving to himself that he could still make a difference. Hope watched him closely as he worked, her eyes following every movement he made. It was as if she was trusting him to save her baby. He could feel the weight of that trust, and it both humbled and terrified him. This wasn't a simple case of healing a broken leg or treating an infection. This was life and death. This was a mother's hope placed in his hands. As Malcolm began to administer the fluids, Hope moved closer, her breath heavy and labored from the long journey. She nudged his shoulder, her warm muzzle brushing against his skin. The contact, though simple, was a reminder of the raw bond between them. He could feel her strength, the quiet strength of a creature that had survived the harshest conditions, that had traveled miles in search of help. It was a reminder of what he had forgotten, that sometimes healing wasn't just about medicine. It was about faith, about the belief that, despite the odds, something good could come from even the darkest of places. Malcolm gently stroked Hope's mane, then turned his attention back to the foal. The small body was still burning with fever, but the fluids were slowly starting to make a difference. He could feel the tiny pulses in Chance's veins as he watched the steady drip of the IV. The foal was responding, albeit slowly, but that was enough for now. There was still a chance. "Just a little longer," Malcolm murmured, as if the words could reach the foal. "You've made it this far. We're not giving up on you." For hours, Malcolm worked tirelessly, rotating between caring for the foal and checking in on Hope. She hadn't moved from her spot by the porch, though Malcolm could see that she, too, was weary. Her body was gaunt, the long journey having drained her reserves. But she refused to leave her foal's side, her loyalty unwavering. And yet, even as he worked, the question loomed in the back of his mind. What had brought this wild mare here? What had caused her to seek him out? Of all people, there was no logical explanation for it. He hadn't treated horses in years, and even then, his expertise had been limited to more domesticated animals. He had left the world of large animals behind, preferring the quiet life of a hermit. And yet, here they were. Hope had found him, and now he was responsible for not just her life, but her foal's. But Malcolm had learned over the years that sometimes logic didn't have the answers. Sometimes the world worked in strange, mysterious ways. It wasn't always about understanding why something happened. It was about taking action, doing what needed to be done. And right now, what needed to be done was saving Chance. As the hours dragged on, Malcolm began to notice small signs of improvement. The foal's breathing became less labored, the fever started to recede, and the tiny body no longer trembled with every breath. It was still a fight, and there was no guarantee of success, but the foal was holding on, and that gave Malcolm the strength to keep pushing forward. Hope seemed to sense the change, too. She moved closer, her warm breath falling on his neck as she nuzzled him gently. And it was a quiet act of gratitude, but it spoke volumes. She trusted him. And in that moment, Malcolm felt something deep within him stir. A sense of purpose, a flicker of something he hadn't felt in years. He wasn't just a man broken by failure anymore. He was someone capable of making a difference. He glanced down at the foal, watching as it struggled to lift its head, its weak body still trembling but fighting to survive. The next step was crucial, getting Chance to drink, to take in nourishment, to fight with the will to live. Malcolm reached for the bottle of milk replacer he had in his emergency supplies. He tilted the foal's head back gently, coaxing it to take the nipple. The foal's mouth worked sluggishly at first, but slowly it began to suckle. Malcolm exhaled in relief, his heart swelling with hope. This was it. The turning point. The moment that would decide whether Chance lived or died. "Come on, little one," Malcolm whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "You've got this." And for the first time in what felt like forever, Malcolm allowed himself to believe it was true. It had been 3 days since Chance first stumbled onto Malcolm's doorstep, and the foal was showing signs of improvement. His breathing had steadied, the fever had broken, and the once fragile body now carried a semblance of strength. Hope, too, had regained some of her energy. She spent her days grazing on the sparse vegetation around the cabin and keeping a watchful eye over her foal. But her gaze never strayed too far from Malcolm. It was as if she knew he was the one keeping her baby alive. For Malcolm, the long hours spent tending to the animals had revived something deep within him, a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. As the foal slowly recovered, so too did the man who had once been known for his skill in healing. Each step forward, however small, seemed to bring him closer to the man he once was, and further from the guilt and isolation he had wrapped himself in for so long. But just as hope seemed to settle into the quiet routine of the days, a shadow loomed over them. It was late afternoon when the sound of a truck engine rumbled through the silence of the desert. Malcolm was on the porch, watching the sunset, when the vehicle came into view, dust billowing in the air as it made its way up the rocky road that led to his cabin. He had been expecting no visitors, but the sudden presence of this vehicle made his pulse quicken. He knew who it was before he even saw the man. The truck came to a screeching halt in front of his cabin, and Malcolm could make out the figure of a tall man stepping out, Russell Blackridge, the wealthy landowner who had long dominated the area. The man had a reputation for being ruthless, using his wealth and influence to push through anything he wanted, regardless of who it hurt. Malcolm had heard whispers of Blackridge's plans for the area. The man wanted to rid the region of its wild mustangs, clearing the land for cattle, and now it seemed his plans had come to a head. Russell Blackridge wasn't alone. A lawyer, tall and slim, stepped out of the passenger side, a briefcase in hand. They both walked up the porch steps, their boots crunching on the gravel. Malcolm's instincts screamed that something wasn't right. He stood up, folding his arms across his chest, trying to appear as calm as he could. He had learned long ago that the less he gave away, the better. But inside, his mind was racing. Russell Blackridge was the last person Malcolm wanted to see. The man represented everything he had spent the last 7 years trying to avoid: wealth, power, and a world where animals were nothing more than assets to be used and discarded at will. "Well, well, Dr. Vance," Russell's deep voice boomed as he approached. "I hear you've been keeping a certain wild mare around here. I'd like to have a word about that." Malcolm's eyes narrowed. "You've got nothing to say to me, Russell?" Russell chuckled, the sound deep and unsettling. I think I do. You see, I've got a plan for this land, and it doesn't involve your little mustangs running wild through it. It's a waste of space, and frankly, it's a danger to the rest of the livestock. I'm here to make sure that doesn't continue." Malcolm felt a knot tighten in his stomach. He knew where this was going. Russell Blackridge wasn't just asking for permission. He was going to take what he wanted, whether or not anyone else agreed with him. The lawyer beside Russell cleared his throat. "Dr. Vance," he said, adjusting his glasses, "we've been instructed to notify you that if you are harboring these wild horses, we will be forced to take legal action. This is a private property issue. You're breaking the law by keeping them here." Russell stepped forward, his boots creaking under his weight. "You don't get to decide who lives here, Malcolm. I own this land, and I'm going to clear it. Those horses are just another nuisance standing in my way, and I've had enough of people like you keeping things that don't belong." Malcolm stood firm, refusing to back down. "These are wild horses. They belong here more than you do." Russell's smile faded, replaced by a cold, calculating stare. "We'll see about that. I've got the town council on my side, and if you don't move those horses, I'll make sure you regret it." Malcolm took a deep breath. his hands clenching into fists. He knew this was coming. It was inevitable. Russell Blackridge had money and influence, and he would use every bit of it to get what he wanted. "You think I'm scared of your threats, Russell?" Malcolm said, his voice low but steady. "I've seen people like you before. You think your money can buy everything, but it doesn't work that way." Russell took a step closer, his eyes narrowing. You'd be wise to reconsider, Dr. Vance. You don't want to make an enemy of me." Malcolm didn't flinch. He was no longer the man who would shrink away from intimidation. He wasn't going to let Russell Blackridge bully him into giving up the horses. Not hope, not chance, not now, not after everything they had been through. Russell and his lawyer stood there for a moment, the tension thick in the air. Finally, the lawyer spoke again. "We'll be back with the proper paperwork. This is your final warning." Malcolm said nothing as they turned and walked back to the truck. His mind was already racing, planning his next move. This wasn't over. He couldn't let it be. As the truck rumbled back down the road, leaving a trail of dust in its wake, Malcolm stood frozen, watching them go. The wind picked up, sweeping the dust into the air, but it did little to clear the weight that now hung over his head. Russell Blackridge had just made things personal. The days that followed were filled with a quiet tension, one that Malcolm could feel pressing down on him with every passing hour. Russell Blackridge's visit had unsettled him more than he was willing to admit, though he refused to show any sign of weakness. He wasn't afraid of threats, but he couldn't ignore the reality of what was happening. Russell wasn't the type of man who backed down, and now he had made it clear that he wouldn't rest until the mustangs were gone, and Malcolm was out of his way. The first signs of the town dividing appeared almost immediately. The whispering started at the local diner, where Malcolm had gone for his weekly groceries. As he walked in, the chatter stopped, and all eyes turned toward him. There was a heaviness in the air, a murmur that swept through the room as the other patrons looked away, pretending not to notice. It was the kind of atmosphere Malcolm had been trying to avoid for years, the kind of town where allegiances were drawn, where power and money held sway over right and wrong. He ordered his coffee in silence, paying with the crumpled bills he had in his pocket, and took a seat in the back. No one spoke to him, but he could feel the weight of their stares. The more he stayed, the more the tension simmered. Finally, one of the farmers, an older man named Joe, walked up to him, his face hard with determination. "You know, Malcolm," Joe said quietly, "Russell's got a lot of pull around here. You're not going to win this fight." Malcolm looked up at Joe, not surprised by the statement. "I'm not fighting for me, Joe. I'm fighting for those horses. They belong here." Joe hesitated for a moment, glancing around the room. "I get that. But the rest of the town, they're going to side with Russell. He owns half the town already, you know. He's got people in the council, and they'll follow him. He can do whatever he wants." Malcolm's jaw tightened. "I don't care what he can do. I'm not backing down." Joe shook his head, his weathered face full of concern. "You might not have a choice in the matter, Malcolm. You think the law's on your side, but Russell's got the power. He's got money, and money talks around here." The weight of Joe's words settled like a stone in Malcolm's stomach, but he didn't show it. He had learned long ago not to trust the opinions of others, not to rely on anything other than his own resolve. Still, there was something in the back of his mind, something that nagged at him as the townsfolk turned their backs and whispered among themselves. As he left the diner, the world outside felt different. It was as though the ground had shifted beneath his feet, and he was standing on unstable soil. The town, his home for so many years, was no longer a place of refuge. It was divided, and Malcolm found himself on the wrong side. The following days were filled with subtle but unmistakable signs that the town was splitting down the middle. On one side, there were those who stood with Russell Blackridge, business owners, farmers, and anyone who had a stake in the land and its resources. On the other side, there were a handful of people who supported Malcolm, but their numbers were small. They were the ones who understood the importance of the wild mustangs to the land, to the ecology, and to the way of life that had been there long before Russell ever set foot in Silver Rock. Malcolm didn't care about the town's politics, but the reality was that the support he had expected was fleeting. He had underestimated the power of money and influence, and now he was paying the price. It wasn't just about the horses anymore. It was about survival. If he lost this fight, if Russell won, the consequences would reach far beyond his cabin, far beyond his own life. By the end of the week, the divide had become even more apparent. Several people from town, people who had once been friendly to him, stopped by the cabin. Some came in hushed voices, quietly offering food or supplies, others delivering letters of support, small gestures, but they spoke volumes. They were the ones who knew the truth, who believed in the right of the wild mustangs to roam free. But their white were in the minority. One morning, as Malcolm was out checking on the foal, a familiar face appeared at the edge of the porch. It was Sarah, the town's schoolteacher, someone Malcolm had known for years. She was younger than him, kind-hearted, with a fierce sense of justice that Malcolm admired. She had always been someone who stood up for what was right, no matter the cost. And in that moment, standing at the edge of his porch, she was offering something more than just support. She was offering hope. "I don't care what anyone else says," Sarah said, her voice low but firm. "Russell Blackridge doesn't get to decide what happens here. Not if we all stand together." Malcolm felt a spark of something he hadn't felt in a long time. There was power in Sarah's words. Maybe, just maybe, he wasn't alone in this fight after all. "I appreciate that, Sarah," Malcolm said, his voice thick with emotion. "But the truth is, I'm not sure how much longer I can hold out. Russell's got the town in his pocket. He's got the council on his side, and once they make their move, it's over." Sarah shook her head. "Not if we fight back. We need to make this about more than just the horses. This is about standing up to someone who's using his power to control everything. It's about what's right." Malcolm nodded slowly, absorbing her words. He had been fighting alone for so long that he had forgotten what it felt like to have someone beside him. And in that moment, surrounded by the stark beauty of the desert and the promise of what could be, he realized something. This wasn't just about the horses. This was about fighting for something bigger than himself. With Sarah by his side and a handful of others in town who still believed in him, Malcolm made a decision. He would fight back, not just for hope and chance, but for the heart of Silver Rock itself. The town might have been divided, but he wasn't going to stand idly by while Russell Blackridge tore it apart. And so, with renewed resolve, Malcolm prepared for the battle ahead. The days that followed Malcolm's decision to stand firm felt like a blur. What started as a quiet, isolated fight in the backwoods of Silver Rock had slowly transformed into something larger, something that might just change the course of the in-town's future. He wasn't alone anymore. He had supporters, people who understood what it meant to protect the wild, to keep the natural balance intact. The town was still divided, but the side that stood with Malcolm was growing. And so, against all odds, they began to fight back. But for Malcolm, it wasn't the politics or the legal battles that kept him up at night. It wasn't even the looming threat of Russell Blackridge's power or the lawyer's words of warning. No, what weighed on his heart most was the life of the foal, Chance. Malcolm had watched him fight for days, each breath labored, each movement sluggish. Despite the fever breaking and the fluids keeping him stable, there were moments when Malcolm thought he might lose him. But then, something miraculous happened. It was early one morning, just as the sun crept over the jagged mountains, that Chance made his first real move since the treatment had begun. Malcolm had been checking the IV drip, adjusting the fluids, When he heard the soft rustling of straw beneath his feet, he looked up in surprise and saw the foal lifting his head slowly, his large brown eyes still clouded with exhaustion, but filled with determination. He wobbled on unsteady legs, and for a moment Malcolm feared the foal might collapse again. But no, Chance didn't fall. Instead, the little foal managed to stand, his legs shaky, but strong enough to hold his weight. He took a hesitant step forward, and then another, his small hooves scraping softly against the wooden floor of the cabin. Malcolm stood frozen, his heart in his throat. This was it. The first sign that Chance was going to make it. "Come on, little one," Malcolm murmured, his voice cracking slightly as he moved closer. He knelt beside the foal, steadying him with a hand on his side. The foal didn't pull away. Instead, he looked up at Malcolm with a sense of trust that tugged at his heart. The connection between them had formed, unspoken but undeniable. Malcolm's fingers brushed the foal's coat, warm and slick from the fever that had finally broken. "You're stronger than you think," he whispered, as if speaking to himself as much as to the foal. Hope stood nearby, watching the scene with quiet attention. She had been a constant presence, never straying far from her baby. Her gaze was steady on Chance, and in that moment it seemed as if she, too, understood that her foal had finally turned a corner. The relief in her eyes was palpable. Malcolm stood up and backed away slowly. Not wanting to disturb the fragile moment, he had worked tirelessly, day and night, to keep the foal alive. And now it seemed that all the effort had finally paid off. The foal took a few more steps forward, testing his legs, and then against all odds, he nuzzled his mother. It was the first time Malcolm had seen the bond between them solidify in such a visible way. Hope lowered her head to nuzzle the foal back, gently, but with a tenderness that spoke of deep, unshakable love. The moment was small, but it felt like a victory, a sign that hope, even in its smallest form, had a way of breaking through the darkest moments. As the days passed, Chance grew stronger, and Malcolm found himself looking forward to each new step the foal took. He was still weak, still vulnerable, but the spark of life had returned to him, and with it, a sense of peace that had eluded Malcolm for years. Hope continued to watch over him with unwavering loyalty, never straying far from her baby's side. Malcolm, too, had become part of their little family, though he knew his role was different from that of a parent. He was the one who helped them survive, who had given them a chance when the odds had seemed impossible. And as the foal began to explore more of the cabin, stretching his legs and testing his limits, Malcolm couldn't help but smile. "Look at you," he murmured, watching Chance take another cautious step. "I never thought I'd see this day." But there was still work to be done. Russell Blackridge wasn't going to back off just because a foal had started to recover. If anything, Malcolm knew the pressure on him would only increase. The legal battle had already begun. The paperwork had been filed, and the town council had called a meeting to discuss the future of the mustangs and the land. Russell's grip on the town was strong, but Malcolm had a different kind of support now. Support from people who believed in doing what was right, not what was easy. And they weren't about to let Russell walk over them without a fight. But even as the town divided and the weight of the legal battle loomed on the horizon, Malcolm found a sense of peace in the smallest of victories. Watching Chance stand, watching Hope nudge him gently as he took his first steps towards healing, reminded Malcolm of why he had made the decision to stay, to fight. It wasn't just about saving a foal or a mare. It was about restoring something inside himself, something that had been broken for years. With Chance's revival, with Hope's unwavering loyalty, Malcolm had rediscovered a piece of himself that he thought he had lost forever. There was still a battle ahead, but for the first time in a long while, he felt ready to face it. And as the sun began to set, casting long shadows over the desert, Malcolm sat on the porch, his gaze drifting over the vast expanse of land before him. The mustangs, free and wild, had always been part of this landscape, and they would remain part of it. no matter what it took. His journey was far from over, but in that moment, Malcolm allowed himself to believe that things could still change, that even in the face of overwhelming odds, redemption was possible. And perhaps, just perhaps, the wild mustang had come into his life not just to be saved, but to help him save himself. The weeks that followed were filled with constant tension. Malcolm hadn't expected things to be easy, but he hadn't anticipated how quickly the town would become a battleground. Russell Blackridge wasn't the kind of man who simply gave up, and now the legal fight was officially underway. The town council meeting was scheduled, and all eyes were on Silver Rock. The question wasn't just about the future of the Mustangs. It was about the future of the land itself, about the town's soul. The day of the meeting, Malcolm woke early, the sun barely cresting the hills. The weight of the situation felt like 1,000 pounds pressing on his chest. He had worked tirelessly to keep Chance alive, to protect hope, and now it felt as though he was standing at the precipice of something bigger than himself. The stakes were higher than they had ever been. Malcolm dressed in the same faded clothes he had worn for years, not concerned with how he looked, only with what he was about to face. The reality of the moment hit him with every step he took toward the town hall. He hadn't stepped into this kind of setting in so long, and the thought of facing the council again, the very council that once saw him as a valued member, brought a wave of unease. What had once been his professional world had now become a reminder of the life he had left behind. The reminders of the person he used to be were all around him now, from the buildings to the people who once respected him. As Malcolm entered the town hall, the whispers began. The room was already filled with townspeople, the usual chatter replaced with sharp glances and hushed conversations. It was clear that this wasn't just another council meeting. It was a defining moment for Silver Rock. Malcolm's eyes scanned the room. There were familiar faces among the crowd, some of whom he hadn't seen in years, others who had never supported him. Most of the farmers and ranchers were sitting on one side, their faces tight with suspicion. On the other side were the few who still believed in the cause, the ones who had secretly helped Malcolm in the past weeks. They gave him subtle nods of encouragement as he made his way to the back, where he would wait his turn. At the front of the room sat Russell Blackridge, his usual smug expression plastered across his face. His lawyer, a sharp-dressed man with a stern demeanor, stood beside him, holding a stack of papers. Russell's posture was stiff, confident, as he knew this battle was his to win. But as Malcolm settled into his seat, he felt a sense of determination wash over him. This wasn't just about the Mustangs anymore. This was about fighting for what was right, for the land, for the people who believed in freedom and nature, not just profit and power. The meeting began with the usual formalities, the mayor standing to make introductions. Malcolm could feel the energy in the room shift when Russell stood up to make his case. His voice was deep, measured, and smooth as he spoke to the council, addressing them with the authority of someone who had controlled this town for far too long. "Ladies and gentlemen," Russell began, his voice carrying easily across the room, "we all know that this town has to evolve. We can't continue to let these wild horses roam freely. They're a menace to the land. They're taking up space that could be used for livestock, and they're damaging the natural resources that we all depend on." Malcolm clenched his fists, listening to the words that fell from Russell's lips like poison. It was the same argument he'd heard before. The Mustangs didn't belong here. They were a nuisance. But it wasn't true. The Mustangs were part of the ecosystem, part of the history of Silver Rock. They had a place here, just as much as the people did. Russell's lawyer chimed in, his voice smooth and calm. "We've conducted surveys, and the results are clear. The Mustangs are a threat to the local environment. Their presence here is unsustainable. We're requesting that the council approve our proposal to remove them from the land and ensure that they no longer pose a threat to the community." Malcolm's heart pounded in his chest. He knew this fight was coming, but hearing it all laid out so clearly, he couldn't let it stand. He had to speak. The mayor, a quiet man who had never been much of a leader, looked toward Malcolm. Dr. Vance, would you like to address the council? Malcolm rose slowly, feeling the weight of the room on his shoulders. He walked to the front, his boots scraping on the wooden floor. As he stood there, facing the council and the crowd, his mind flashed back to everything that had led him here. The decision to help Hope and Chance, the long nights spent nursing the foal back to health, the support of the few who stood by him. He took a deep breath and began. I've lived in this town for years. I've worked as a vet, helped animals, and seen firsthand how important it is to protect our land, our wildlife. But I'm here today, not just to speak for the Mustangs, but for the future of Silver Rock. We've always prided ourselves on being a town that values nature. These horses, these wild Mustangs, they're not a threat. They're part of the fabric of this land, and they deserve to be here. He paused, looking around the room, making eye contact with those who had supported him. There was a flicker of doubt in their eyes, but that they were listening. He could feel it. These horses have roamed these mountains for generations, Malcolm continued, his voice steady. They're not just animals. They're a symbol of the spirit of this land, untamed, free. If we let Russell take them away, we risk losing something that makes this town unique. We lose a piece of our history. We lose our connection to the land. Malcolm's voice cracked slightly, but he pushed through. I've seen the evidence. I've seen the impact these horses have on the environment. It's not what Russell says. It's the truth. Removing them won't help. It will harm us in ways we can't predict. We need to protect the wild. We need to protect the heart of Silver Rock. For a moment, the room was still. The tension was thick, but Malcolm could see a shift. People were starting to listen, to question. Maybe, just maybe, they were beginning to see what he saw. Russell's lawyer stood to counter, but his words fell flat in the face of Malcolm's plea. The truth, as Malcolm knew, was far more powerful than money and influence. The council deliberated for what felt like hours. When the final vote came, it was clear that the tides had shifted. The Mustangs were safe, for now, but the fight wasn't over. Russell Blackridge might have lost this battle, but he wasn't the type to give up. Malcolm knew that, but in that moment, as the council voted to protect the Mustangs and declare the land a sanctuary, he allowed himself a quiet moment of triumph. It wasn't just a victory for him, it was a victory for the town, for Silver Rock, and for the wild creatures who called it home. The town hall meeting had been a turning point. For the first time in weeks, Malcolm felt a rush of hope course through him. Russell Blackridge had been defeated, at least for the time being, and the Mustangs were safe. The land was declared a sanctuary, and it seemed that Silver Rock had chosen its side. But that sense of relief was short-lived. Malcolm knew that Russell Blackridge was not a man who simply accepted defeat. Even though the vote had gone in their favor, the pressure was far from over. The fight wasn't won. It had only just begun. Russell would be back. He would find another way to push his agenda forward. And this time, Malcolm would have to be ready. The days following the council's decision were filled with a strange calm, an uneasy peace that settled over Silver Rock. The Mustangs roamed the land, free and wild as they were meant to be. The tension that had gripped the town loosened slightly, but there were still whispers in the streets. There were still those who sided with Russell, and their eyes lingered on Malcolm with a mix of disdain and uncertainty. But it was in the days following the council's vote that something unexpected happened. It started with a sound, a soft thud at the door. Malcolm was in the small cabin, tending to the animals, when he heard it. At first, he thought it was just the wind, but then it came again. A light knock, almost tentative. He opened the door slowly, half expecting another visitor from town, someone looking to either congratulate him or, more likely, criticize him for standing up to Russell. Instead, he found Hope standing at the threshold. She wasn't looking at him, not directly. Her gaze was fixed on something behind him, her ears twitching as she scanned the cabin. At first, Malcolm stood still, unsure of what to make of the mare's sudden appearance. But then he noticed something that made his heart skip a beat. Beside Hope, barely standing on his shaky legs, was Chance. The foal had grown in strength since the day Malcolm had first laid eyes on him, but there was something else, something that had changed. Chance was no longer the fragile, sickly animal he had once been. He was standing tall now, his legs firm beneath him, his eyes bright with life. It took Malcolm a moment to process the sight. He had spent so many nights by the foal's side, feeding him, nursing him, hoping and praying that he would make it. And now, standing before him, was the proof of his efforts. Chance was alive, and not just alive. He was thriving. Hope nudged him gently, almost as if she was urging him to pay attention, and for a moment, Malcolm wondered if she understood just how much her presence meant to him. She had brought him back to life, in a way, too. Her trust in him, her quiet plea for help when he thought he could do no more. It had been the catalyst for his own redemption. The mare stepped aside, and Malcolm couldn't help but smile, feeling a wave of gratitude wash over him. You've come back," he whispered. "You and Chance. You've come back home." Hope let out a soft whinny, the sound a quiet confirmation that she was indeed back to stay, and she wasn't going anywhere. The foal, however, took tentative steps forward, testing his legs, his hooves clicking softly on the wood of the porch. His mother stood by him, unwavering and ever watchful, her presence a constant reminder of the bond between them, a bond that had survived against the odds. Malcolm knelt down, extending his hand toward Chance, who hesitated for a moment before stepping forward and nuzzling him gently. It was a gesture of trust, of understanding. And in that moment, as Malcolm felt the warmth of the foal's nuzzle against his palm, he realized something he had known deep down for a long time, but had never fully embraced. He wasn't just saving animals. He wasn't just standing up for a cause. This was about something more. It was about healing. It was about the strength of life and the power of second chances, not just for the creatures he cared for, but for himself. For the first time in years, Malcolm allowed himself to cry, softly, quietly, without the weight of guilt or regret. The tears weren't just for the foal or for Hope. They were for the man he used to be, for the person he had become, and for the person he could still be. The pain of his past had not disappeared, but it no longer ruled him. It no longer defined him. And maybe, just maybe, he could be more than the man who had failed once before. Hope's presence had done something he hadn't expected. It had reminded him that healing didn't come with a timeline. It wasn't about erasing the past. It was about moving forward, step by step, with faith in something bigger than yourself. Just as Hope had returned, so had he. Just as Chance had fought to live, so had he fought for his own redemption. "You're not alone," he whispered to them both, as if speaking to the wild mare and her foal, but also to himself. "We've all made it this far, and we're going to keep going." Malcolm spent the next few hours with them, watching as Chance continued to explore, his steps growing more confident with each passing moment. Hope stood nearby, her watchful eyes always on her foal, but she was relaxed now, as if knowing that they were safe for the time being. And as the sun began to set, painting the sky with hues of gold and crimson, Malcolm found himself standing in the quiet stillness of his cabin, watching the mustangs graze in the distance, knowing that, for now, the fight was over. They had won. But he also knew that the next challenge would be just around the corner. Russell Blackridge wouldn't stay silent for long. But whatever came next, Malcolm felt ready. He had hope. He had Chance. And, for the first time in a long time, he had himself. The wind had picked up, swirling dust across the dry, barren land that stretched out in all directions. It had been a month since the council's vote, and the small town of Silver Rock had settled into a tense sort of calm. The mustangs roamed freely through the valley, their presence a quiet testament to the fight that had unfolded. It wasn't over, but for now, the town had chosen a side, and the Mustangs had won their place. Malcolm stood at the edge of the valley, his eyes scanning the horizon. Hope and Chance were nearby, grazing together. The sight of them, alive, free, and healthy, was a comfort. It was a reminder of what had been at stake and what he had fought for. But that comfort was tempered by the knowledge that the battle was far from won. The looming threat of Russell Blackridge hung over them like a shadow. The man wasn't one to back down easily. Despite the council's decision, Malcolm knew that Russell would stop at nothing to push his agenda forward. Money and power could buy a lot of things, and Malcolm had no illusion about who controlled most of the town. But for now, the focus had shifted. The Mustangs were safe, at least temporarily, and the next step would be to ensure that the land remained protected, that the sanctuary wasn't just a piece of paper, but a real, enforceable law. And that was where the true battle would take place. The final meeting to decide the fate of the sanctuary had been scheduled. The council members had agreed to convene once more, this time to ratify the decision officially. The outcome of this meeting would determine whether the Mustangs would remain, whether the land would be preserved, or whether Russell would get his way and clear it for his cattle. Malcolm knew that this meeting would be a turning point. If they lost now, if the land was taken away from the wild Mustangs, all the effort, all the sacrifices would have been in vain. He wasn't sure what to expect, but he wasn't about to sit back and let Russell win. This time, they would have to fight not just with their voices, but with the full weight of the law. Malcolm's resolve hardened as he made his way to the town hall. He had already seen what Russell was capable of, how easily the man could manipulate and pressure others to get what he wanted. But the Mustangs were more than just a symbol now. They were living, breathing proof of the strength of life, of the will to survive against the odds. And they weren't just Malcolm's fight. They were the fight of anyone who still believed in the preservation of the wild. As he entered the town hall, Malcolm noticed the room was filled with familiar faces. The seats were packed, not just with the usual townsfolk, but with people from neighboring areas who had come to show their support. They had seen the battle play out in the papers, heard the whispers on the wind, and now they were here to make their voices heard. Russell Blackridge was already seated, his usual smug expression firmly in place. His lawyer sat beside him, a stack of papers neatly arranged before him, as if the outcome had already been decided. Malcolm's eyes briefly flicked to the lawyer, who was scribbling notes with an air of quiet confidence. It was as if they were prepared to win, no matter what. The council members filed in, and the meeting began. The atmosphere was thick with tension. Malcolm could feel it in his bones. The weight of the moment, the uncertainty of what was to come. The room seemed to hold its breath as the mayor opened the floor. "Ladies and gentlemen," the mayor began, his voice steady but strained, "we are here today to make a final decision regarding the future of the Mustang Sanctuary and the use of this land. The council has reviewed the evidence, and now we will hear arguments from both sides." Russell Blackridge stood up, his presence commanding attention. The room seemed to shift, all eyes turning toward him as he began to speak. "I'm sure you all understand the importance of this decision," Russell said, his voice smooth and calculated. "The Mustangs, as some of you may have noticed, are a growing problem. Their presence here is damaging to the environment, to our resources. This land should be used to its full potential for the benefit of all. We can't afford to let a few wild horses stand in the way of progress." The words hung in the air, heavy and full of intent. Malcolm could see the familiar faces of the farmers and ranchers nodding in agreement, their eyes focused on Russell, their loyalty clear. The man had power, and he wasn't afraid to use it. "But the Mustangs are part of this land's legacy," Malcolm spoke up, his voice cutting through the tension like a knife. "They've been here for generations, longer than any of us. This land was never meant to be controlled. It's a sanctuary, one that should protect the wild, not erase it." Malcolm paused, allowing his words to settle. He could feel the weight of the room shifting. The eyes of the townsfolk were now on him, and he could sense that they were beginning to listen. This isn't about progress, Malcolm continued. This is about preserving something that is bigger than all of us. This is about keeping the heart of Silver Rock intact, about honoring the land's natural beauty in its wild inhabitants. He turned to the council, meeting each of their gazes. You have a chance to do something that will matter. You have the power to protect this land, not just for us, but for future generations. Do not let money and power take that away. For a moment, there was silence. Then, slowly, one of the council members, a woman named Claire, stood up. She had been quiet throughout the meeting, her face unreadable, but now her voice rang out clear and strong. I've heard enough, she said, her gaze steady. I have lived in this town all my life. I've seen the land change, and I've seen the wild horses roaming this valley. They're not a threat. They're part of who we are. I vote to protect the sanctuary. The room fell silent. Another council member, a younger man named Peter, spoke next. I agree. We can't let greed dictate the future of this land. I vote to protect the sanctuary. And one by one, the council members made their votes. The tension in the room was unbearable, but the outcome was clear. The sanctuary would be preserved. The mustangs would remain. As the vote was counted, the mayor looked up, his expression one of relief. The motion passes. The land will remain protected as it is sanctuary for the mustangs. The vote is final. The room erupted into murmurs, and Malcolm felt a rush of emotion he hadn't expected. It wasn't just relief. It was a sense of triumph. The mustangs had won. Silver Rock had won. But even as the victory settled in, Malcolm knew the fight wasn't over. Russell Blackridge wouldn't give up easily, and there would be more battles ahead. But for now, the mustangs were safe. And that was a victory worth celebrating. The sun was beginning to set over Silver Rock, painting the sky with hues of orange, pink, and violet. The desert landscape stretched out before Malcolm, vast and quiet, but full of life. Hope and chance grazed peacefully in the distance, the foal now strong and confident as he trotted beside his mother, his body no longer fragile but full of energy. The sight of them, together and free, filled Malcolm with a deep sense of peace, a peace that had been so elusive for so long. It had been months since the battle over the mustangs had begun. It had felt like a lifetime of struggle, of standing up against a force that seemed unstoppable. But now, in the quiet of the evening, Malcolm could feel the weight of the fight lifting. The sanctuary had been established, the mustangs had won their right to live freely on the land, and Silver Rock had, in its own way, chosen to preserve the wild. Malcolm took a deep breath, the crisp desert air filling his lungs. There was something about the desert, its vastness, its solitude, that had always drawn him in. It had been the place where he had come to heal, to escape the pain of his past. But it had also been the place where he had rediscovered himself, where he had found a new purpose in life. Standing at the edge of the valley, Malcolm felt a sense of connection, not just to the land, but to the creatures that called it home. The mustangs, with their untamed beauty and strength, had become a symbol of everything he had fought for. They were wild, free, and fierce, just as he had once been, before the weight of his past had crushed him. And now, in their presence, he felt that spark of life returning. He was no longer the man who had walked away from everything. He was someone who had stood his ground, someone who had fought for what was right, and someone who had found redemption in the process. Hope and chance were a testament to that redemption. They had come into his life at a time when he had been ready to give up. Hope had found him when he had been at his lowest, and together they had fought for the future of the mustangs. Together they had created something lasting, something that would stand the test of time. As the last rays of the sun dipped below the horizon, Malcolm turned and made his way back to the cabin. The night air was cool now. and the stars were starting to appear in the sky, twinkling like diamonds scattered across a vast, dark canvas. He walked slowly, his footsteps light on the dusty earth, the sound of his boots, the only noise in the stillness of the evening. When he reached the cabin, he paused for a moment, standing on the porch and looking out over the land. There was no more urgency, no more need to rush. The fight had been won, and the land was safe. The mustangs were free. Inside the cabin, everything was quiet. The fire in the hearth crackled softly, casting a warm glow across the room. The small, humble space was filled with the smell of wood smoke and the soft scent of herbs that Malcolm had been using to care for the animals. It wasn't much, but it was enough. He had found a sense of home here, a place where he could live in peace, where he could continue to do the work he loved without the shadow of his past haunting him. Malcolm moved to the small wooden table, where a stack of papers sat, untouched for days. The legal battle was over, but there were still tasks to be done. Documents to be filed, official business to attend to. But for the first time in a long while, he didn't feel the pressure of it weighing on him. The work would get done in its own time. For now, he allowed himself a moment to rest, to savor the quiet that had settled over the land. He sat down at the table and glanced out the window, where hope and chance were still visible in the distance, silhouetted against the twilight sky. It was as if they were watching over the land, guardians of the wild. And for Malcolm, they represented something more. They represented the chance to begin again, the opportunity to rewrite the story of his life. The phone on the table rang, breaking the silence. Malcolm reached for it, picking it up with a sense of familiarity. It was Sarah, the schoolteacher from town, the one who had supported him from the beginning, who had stood by him even when it seemed like all hope was lost. "Malcolm, it's Sarah." Her voice came through the line, clear and warm. "I just wanted to check in and see how things are going. The council's decision was the right one, and I'm glad to see everything worked out for the best." Malcolm smiled to himself. "It's over, Sarah. We've won. The Mustangs have their sanctuary. Silver Rock has chosen to protect the land, to protect the wild." He could hear the smile in Sarah's voice as she responded. "That's wonderful. You did it, Malcolm. You stood up when no one else would." Malcolm leaned back in his chair, feeling a sense of contentment that he hadn't known in years. "We did it, Sarah. All of us. It wasn't just me. The town came together. The Mustangs came together. And in the end, we all got what we needed." There was a pause on the other end of the line, a quiet moment that stretched out before Sarah spoke again. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said, the connection between the land, the animals, and all of us. I think we've all forgotten what it means to live in harmony with nature, but maybe we're starting to remember." Malcolm nodded, even though Sarah couldn't see him. "I think you're right. It's not just about protecting the Mustangs. It's about protecting everything, the land, the life that calls it home. It's about remembering that we're all part of this." Another pause, and then Sarah's voice softened. "I'm proud of you, Malcolm. You've come a long way." Malcolm's heart swelled. "Thanks, Sarah. I couldn't have done it without you." As the call ended, Malcolm set the phone down and stood up, moving toward the window once again. The night had settled in, and the stars above were shining brighter than ever. He watched as hope and chance moved together across the valley, their silhouettes framed by the light of the moon. And as he stood there, alone in the quiet of the cabin, Malcolm felt something stir deep within him, something he hadn't felt in years. Peace. He had done what he set out to do. He had given the Mustangs a chance to live free, to roam the land as they always had, and in doing so, he had given himself a second chance. For the first time in a long time, he knew that healing wasn't just something he could give to others. It was something he could give to himself, and that was enough. Ooh, underscore, 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 underscore.